So for this lesson, we're going to look at improving personal effectiveness. Now, this is a long-term growth chapter, so not a lot of this is going to be, particularly relevant for, like BOC prep or anything. It's more about being an athletic trainer. So I'm going to go over some of this, to introduce you more to the topic, and then realize each one of these topics has a lot more information on it, and I would really encourage you to dive into this information in more depth as you continue your professional career. There's lots of great resources out there for all of these, and this is what will really make you an exceptional athletic trainer beyond just your book knowledge. So the first thing and the overarching principle that we're going to talk about for this lesson is this idea of stimulus and response, right? When we have a normal reaction, we have the stimulus and then it immediately leads to a response. The main thing, if there was anything we could focus on for improving our overall personal effectiveness, would be to create this pause that it shows here, this conscious thought or pause. So that way we have a conscious, considered behavior opposed to spontaneous behavior. So some of the things to look at regarding these differences between spontaneous and considered, right? So each of these are different behaviors. The idea is if we have a considered behavior, then we're picking the appropriate type of behavior. And so we have this grid aspect here with the openness of communication and the consideration for others. And there really is a time for each of these in some level for certain situations. And so there are some that are obviously better than others. Assertive is best. Concealed aggressive behavior is probably worse. But we'll see some other charts that go very closely with these that then describe where there might be some times, not for pure concealed aggressive behavior, but this idea of delay with that. And this is based off of these three main categories: passive behaviors, assertive behaviors, and aggressive behaviors. Right. And so you can see this, it's a combination of your openness and then your concern for others. High is assertive, high levels of communication, high respect for others, low consideration for others, and high openness of communication, meaning being more vocal about things. They consider this, the idea of expressing your feelings at the expense of others is aggressive. And then passive is obviously low communication but high consideration for others, basically yielding to them on a regular basis. The other component with personal effectiveness, with that being your communication, right, to people, is listening and being an effective listener. And you can see different components listed here as far as what creates an effective listener. And we've all heard about active participation, that listening is an active thing, and that's the difference between listening and hearing. One of the main interesting things that the textbook points out is the idea that listening is really hard, not because it's hard to pay attention because we're getting too much information, but it's hard to pay attention because we're not getting enough information fast enough. Our brain can actually handle 4 times the amount of words per minute that the average speaking is. And so that lack of needed attention is where you can hear while thinking of other things, right? Whether that's the response or all those negative aspects. And so really the idea here is you've got to find a way to turn that extra brain power that is sometimes allowed to go off in a different direction and turn that to listening and paying attention. Because this is a great model here of what is occurring during the communication process. And when you think of this, this is nothing, groundbreaking in what's occurring, but considering each step as a possible breakdown in communication is where we see this need for feedback at the end. So if you first think that you start with a mind picture in your own mind as the speaker, right? So you know what you want to say or what you want to communicate. You then have to encode that into words. So we've all been in situations where we just couldn't find the right words. That's a breakdown between the mind picture and the encoded picture. You then have the message using those words. It then has to be decoded and transitioned from words to an understanding of their own mind picture. And so the idea with this really is each time we have these transmissions, there's a possibility for that game of telephone that you play in school in here, for the message to be distorted slightly. And the book gave a lot of good examples of that. One of the most specific ones that they mentioned that was interesting to myself was the idea that we use language based off of experience, not based off of definition. So when we use words, the words that we use to both encode and decode, right, there's not a standard definition that goes from mind picture to encoding. This is really based more on our experiences. And so there's, I'm sure you've thought of with yourself or just with others, these idea of trigger words, words that have, more negative connotation or trigger a specific emotional response that's not necessarily associated with the textbook definition. And knowing these trigger words, or at least knowing that the words that we use may not be interpreted the same way that we interpret them, because our mind picture of the word is different than their mind picture of the word, shows why this idea of active listening and feedback that we'll talk about later is so important. Communication barriers, these, aren't anything, particularly enlightening, especially with the physical thing. It's easy to avoid external physical barriers. But thinking of the other categories, like internal physical barriers, the idea that, if you're fatigued or the person you're speaking to is fatigued, that they're not going to be able to communicate as easily, right? Emotional barriers, being distracted from everything from personal problems, right, to being the target of speaker emotions, right? And then intellectual things, these ideas of being unfamiliar with message content or the word usage, as well as the idea that there can be internal intellectual difficulties with, everything from, processing and your ability to process quickly or to do those sorts of aspects or just get confused easily. So these are all barriers that need to be considered when we're looking at communication. And so how you go about looking at communication is using some specific techniques. And the book described 4 techniques: paraphrasing, perception checking, probing, and questioning. And each one of these, you can see when it would be appropriate to use them or the uses and some examples of them. But basically, these are ways to check that communication has occurred with this feedback loop that we see there at the end. So those are good strategies to take a look at. Book then moved on to conflict management, and the idea here is that conflict is any sort of communication that elicits a more negative physiological response. Right? So the sweating, racing heart rate, all that sort of stuff, and understanding that part of the job of the athletic trainer is to have these difficult conversations, and that conflict doesn't necessarily need to be negative. It just means that we have competing interests or competing points of view, or just different points of view, or just a lack of understanding. It really doesn't matter what is causing it. the idea is that for whatever reason, it's eliciting an emotional response in one of the participants. And so you can see here, this is where that assertiveness and cooperative, right? This is very similar to the previous chart, right? But now we're talking about strategies to do this. And so see, you can see down here, this is what I was talking about with avoiding, right? Similar to, the passive aggressive aspect. The difference being in avoiding here, there are some times, especially when things are emotionally charged, that it's not the appropriate time to deal with it. Right? Sometimes, if somebody's very emotional, that's not the time to have a difficult conversation with them. You have to let them cool off first. And so as long as you come back to that, then it's not, and you're not harboring negative feelings, you're in that like passive aggressive thing, but it's really not aggressive unless you are harboring those negative feelings. Talks about competing, collaborating, accommodating, and compromising as far as the different values along this continuum. And each one has their appropriate place and their own definitions with that based off of their level of cooperation and assertiveness. Whether it is, cooperating, meaning more listening and accepting the other person's point of view versus assertiveness and stressing your point of view. And there's appropriate times for each. And you can think of that. I mean, obviously collaborating is great, right? Where we're high in both aspects. But if we tried to collaborate on every single thing, that takes a lot of time, and time can be a precious resource. And if the decision isn't important enough for collaboration, then some of these others might work as well, as far as, maybe a compromising is easier where we each just, get a little bit of what was going on. But there are also times that are really important that, you do have a competing conflict management strategy where, despite the fact that the other individual might disagree, you need to stand firm on your own thoughts. And you can think of, athlete safety with a coach as one of those sorts of times where you have to stand firm, right, and be very assertive in a competing where you need to win to get the outcome that is needed for your athlete. So switching from communication styles at the beginning to then managing conflict to now a specific type of conflict that might be there is giving and receiving feedback based off of observed situations that you need to address so that way the individual can grow. And I really liked how the textbook called this feedback for improvement opposed to like constructive criticism or negative feedback. The idea here is you need to start first and foremost with what is your intent for giving feedback. And if your intent for giving feedback is not for improvement, right? It's for some other reason, giving a piece of the mind or whatever, then it's really not feedback. It's just more initiating conflict. And so this SBI model works really well for that, from the idea of how to make concise feedback so that way it can be usable. And it's basically a three-part thing. You describe the situation so that the individual knows, specifically what you're talking about and has context for it. Then you describe as, accurately as you can, even modeling if appropriate, what the behavior was, and then deliver the impact, meaning, how was this impacting? And this is where I statements become really important opposed to you statements. The idea that, I, felt this, or I saw somebody, I saw this. And so it has this cause and effect relationship so that it's not just a preference thing that you're talking about with your feedback for improvement. Here has some advice on how to give effective feedback with that. Right? And the big one, in my opinion, is to avoid judging the person, but judging the behavior. The idea here is that we're describing and trying to deal with the behavior not deal with the person, right? It's easier to change behaviors, but behaviors don't necessarily mean the person is their behaviors, right? We're trying to improve that. And so that really helps with that as well. So when we're looking at difficult conversations going in with that, this is all with that. It's really anything you have difficulty talking about. The reason that I left this in, because this is something that was particularly meaningful to me. The idea that oftentimes our conversations are difficult or we perceive conflict because we have created in our own mind a negative mental image of how this conversation is going to go. We believe that the coach is going to be upset or the athlete's going to be upset or the staff member we're talking about, the student we're talking to will be upset and this will go poorly. But that is just that is our mental image of what has occurred. And it may be based off of previous experience or great information. But it is also still possible that we're creating it ourselves and that's not how they're going to react. So the textbook author had a good piece of advice. If you're going to create a negative mental image, also create a positive mental image so that you realize that this is just one way that it could go. It may go that way, but we don't know that going in. So continuing on with that and starting to wrap up in as far as areas of personal improvement. We talked a lot about communication and interpersonal things. Now we're going to focus on ourselves. And if you've never spent any time looking at the time management matrix, this is really important. It was originally described in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. If you've never watched the time management lecture by, I'm blanking on the name, but he's the same guy that did the last lecture. If you Google last lecture, you'll find him. But he talks a lot about this. And this is this idea here that we have 4 quadrants in how we spend our time, right? And it's based off of the same continuum, low to high importance and low to high urgency. And oftentimes what ends up happening is we're stuck in these ideas where we are creating situations where we are stuck here, and this is messed up. This should be high over here. This is high urgency, high importance, low urgency, low importance here. And so when we look at these things and we look at this, we stick too much time in this crisis mode where we're just getting stuff done, that putting out fires quickly, that we get so tired we then go into low sort of things, doing things so that we seem busy. And they talked about the neurophysiology of this idea of busyness, that as long as you're busy doing something, the idea is then you can't be blamed for not getting your stuff done. And that's just not really true. Sometimes you're just doing the wrong things. And so the idea and the real value in this is you need to focus on the things of high importance and not do the things of low importance, right? This low urgency, right? Low importance aspect, or even here, right? These sorts of things, right? Low importance but high urgency aspects with that. We get into these things where we create a situation where we're doing things that aren't important, but they seem to be urgent. Meetings and different aspects like that. That's just a waste of time. If it's not important, then it really doesn't need to be an emphasis of your time. And so then that goes from time management. If you really want to think of time management and all these aspects, you have to think about yourself and your entire group of time. And so this is where roles, goals, actions, and schedules aspect comes into play. So you need to think, what roles do you do? Like what, if you had to define yourself, what sort of roles do you play? What are your goals within those roles? And they use this example of a from, to, by. So from a 2.0 GPA to a 3.0 GPA by the date. So from, to, by, right? As far as their goal method. And that really shows and helps with this idea of, since you know where you are and then where you're going, it helps make the date more realistic. Then you have to develop the specific actions that you need to do in order to accomplish your goal, and then make sure you schedule time to do those activities. And so it's just a way of prioritizing your time and finding a way to get that done. And then coming towards the end here, work-life balance, the idea that in reality this is elusive at best and a myth at worst, right? The idea that you're going to find some sort of balance and then just stay on to that just really isn't true. If you go back to chapter 1 with this idea of polarity, right, this is something that has to reoccurringly be done. And so you look at this then on how it goes, and you can see some strategies for that. And the biggest one is really going to be building support networks, realizing there are going to be times in your life, right, that work may be a little bit more pressing, and there will be times that family will be a little bit more pressing. And the idea, especially in athletic training, in a sport environment, we think of in-season and off-season sort of stuff. In-season work is going to take a little bit more, but you have to balance that with the idea that, during off-seasons, you may have more time to take off. And then I mentioned a little bit there, this neuroscience of busyness, all these different things that occur, and all of these little tasks and these little decisions and things that you do all day require brain power. And so the idea is if we can improve brain function by decreasing the amount of external stimuli that's not helping us and make those decisions, or that are just useless decisions, that can save a lot of brain power. So again, that's the end of this lesson, but it's definitely not the end of the topic. This was something that I went through way too briefly to get much out of it. I really just hope to introduce this to you and eventually maybe spark enough interest that in the future, as you look at your career development, you will find some of these interesting and will continue to develop those throughout your professional life. Again, if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks.